There are escapes that defy logic. Escapes that, when examined closely, seem to violate every law of probability, every principle of human endurance, every barrier that geography and cruelty can erect. Solomon Northup's escape from slavery was one of these. Not because he ran through swamps or fought his captors, but because he did something far more impossible. He convinced the very system designed to erase him that he had never stopped existing. In 1853, a man walked out of a Louisiana plantation carrying nothing but a letter. 12 years earlier, he had been a free citizen of New York, a violinist, a father, a man with legal papers proving his freedom. Then, in a single night in Washington, D.C., he vanished. When he reappeared over a decade later, he had survived something that killed most men within months: the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South, where the average life expectancy of a field slave was 7 years. But here's what makes historians pause. What makes this case so peculiar: it's been studied for over a century. Solomon didn't just survive. He orchestrated an escape so intricate, so dependent on impossible coincidences and perfect timing, that some scholars have spent decades trying to understand how it actually worked. An escape that required a white man to risk his life, a letter to travel hundreds of miles without being intercepted, and a legal system that had every reason to deny his freedom to suddenly, inexplicably, acknowledge it. The details of those 12 years, what Solomon witnessed, what he endured, and most disturbingly, what he learned about the machinery of slavery, would become one of the most important documents in American history. But the escape itself? That remains a mystery wrapped in questions that have never been fully answered. How does a man survive 12 years of systematic dehumanization without losing himself? How does he maintain hope when every legal, social, and physical barrier tells him there is none? And most puzzling of all, how does he engineer freedom from within a system specifically designed to make freedom impossible? Before we continue with the story of Solomon Northup and the impossible chain of events that led to his freedom, if you enjoy mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about history, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Leave a like if you want more stories that make you question what really happened. And tell us in the comments, what state or city are you listening from? Now, let's go back to where it all began, not in Louisiana, but in a place where Solomon believed he was completely safe. The answers to these questions lie not in a single moment of dramatic escape, but in a series of calculated decisions, extraordinary risks, and coincidences so unlikely that they seem almost orchestrated by fate itself. This is the story of how one man refused to be erased, and how the very act of remembering who he was became the key to his survival. Saratoga Springs, New York, in the spring of 1841, was a town that hummed with prosperity and promise. Nestled in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, the town had transformed from a quiet settlement into one of the most fashionable destinations in the northeastern United States. The mineral springs that bubbled up from the earth had been known to the Mohawk people for centuries, but by the 1840s, they had become the foundation of a thriving resort economy that attracted wealthy families from New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and even as far south as Charleston. The summer season brought an influx of visitors who filled the grand hotels that lined Broadway, the United States Hotel, Congress Hall, the Columbian, establishments that rivaled anything in New York City for elegance and sophistication. With the visitors came a demand for entertainment. Orchestras, theater companies, dance instructors, and musicians of all kinds. For a skilled violinist, Saratoga Springs in the summer was a place where a man could make a respectable living. Solomon Northup had built exactly that kind of life. At 33 years old, he was a man of medium height and strong build, with intelligent eyes and hands that moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years mastering his craft. He had been born in Minerva, New York, in July of 1808, the son of Mintus Northup, a freed slave who had been emancipated by his master's will in the 1790s. That single fact, that his father had been legally freed before Solomon's birth, meant that Solomon had been born free, a status that carried significant legal weight in New York State. Mintus Northup had been a farmer, and he had raised his children with a clear understanding of what freedom meant and how fragile it could be. He had taught Solomon to read and write, skills that were not universal even among free black citizens in the early 19th century. He had taught him the importance of documentation, of keeping papers that proved his status, of understanding the law, and he had taught him a trade, music, that would allow him to move through white society with a degree of respect and autonomy that was rare for black men in that era. Solomon had married Anne Hampton in 1829 when he was 21 years old. Anne was a woman of mixed heritage, the daughter of a free black woman and a white man, and she possessed a quiet strength and practical intelligence that complemented Solomon's more gregarious nature. Together, they had built a life that, while modest by the standards of Saratoga's wealthy visitors, was comfortable and secure by the standards of their community. They had 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. Elizabeth, the eldest, was 12 years old in the spring of 1841, a bright girl who helped her mother with cooking and household work. Margaret was 10, quieter than her sister but equally sharp. Alonzo was 7, a boy who showed signs of inheriting his father's musical talent. The family lived in a small house that Solomon owned outright, a significant achievement for any working man in that era, and especially for a free black man. Solomon's reputation as a musician had spread throughout the region. He played the violin with a skill that came from years of practice and natural talent. He performed at weddings, political gatherings, holiday celebrations, and the elaborate balls that were held at the grand hotels during the summer season. He knew the popular pieces of the day, waltzes, reels, contradances, and he could read sheet music, which allowed him to learn new pieces quickly. His clients included some of the most prominent families in the area: judges, merchants, lawyers, politicians. They knew him by name, and they trusted him. This reputation was more than just a source of income. In a society where free black citizens existed in a precarious legal and social position, reputation was a form of protection. Solomon was known as a reliable, skilled, respectable man. He paid his debts, he kept his word, and he caused no trouble. Local officials knew him. The sheriff knew him. The judges who presided over the county courts knew him. This network of recognition and respect was, in many ways, more valuable than the free papers he kept carefully stored in his home. Anne worked as a cook, primarily in the hotels and private homes of wealthy families. She was known for her skill with traditional dishes and her ability to manage large meals for parties and gatherings. During the summer season, when Saratoga was at its busiest, she could earn significant wages. During the winter, work was scarcer, and the family lived more frugally, but they managed. The Northup family attended the local Baptist church, where they were part of a small but established community of free black families. There were perhaps 50 or 60 free black residents in Saratoga Springs in 1841, most of them working as laborers, servants, cooks, or craftsmen. They lived in a society that was, by the standards of the time, relatively tolerant. New York had abolished slavery gradually between 1799 and 1827, and by 1841, the state had a significant population of free black citizens who possessed legal rights, including the right to own property, to sue in court, and to vote if they met certain property requirements. But tolerance was not the same as equality, and Solomon was acutely aware of the boundaries that circumscribed his life. He could play music at the grand hotels, but he could not stay in them as a guest. He could vote, but only because he owned property. Most black men in New York could not meet the property requirements that had been specifically designed to limit their political power. He could walk the streets freely, but he knew that if he traveled south, even into neighboring states like Pennsylvania or New Jersey, his freedom papers might not be respected. And he knew that there were men, kidnappers who specialized in capturing free black people and selling them into slavery in the South, who operated even in northern states. This was the world Solomon Northup inhabited in March of 1841, a world of relative security built on reputation, documentation, and careful navigation of social boundaries. It was a world that felt stable, predictable, safe, and it was about to be shattered completely. The offer came in late March, just as the winter was beginning to loosen its grip on upstate New York. Two men approached Solomon in Saratoga Springs, introducing themselves as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They were well-dressed, affable, and they spoke with the confidence of men who were accustomed to conducting business. They explained that they were members of a traveling circus company that was making its way south through New York State and into Washington, D.C. The circus featured trained horses, acrobats, and various entertainments, and they needed a musician to accompany the performances. They had heard of Solomon's reputation as a violinist, they said, and they were prepared to offer him generous terms, $1 per day, plus all expenses paid. The tour would last only a few weeks. They would travel through Albany, down to New York City, and then to Washington, D.C., where the circus would perform for several days before returning north. Solomon would be back in Saratoga Springs by early April, well before the summer season began. It was an attractive offer. $1 per day was good wages, and the expenses would be covered, meaning Solomon could save most of what he earned. Anne was preparing to leave for Sandy Hill, a town about 30 miles north, where she had secured a position as a cook for a wealthy family. The children would be staying with relatives. The timing seemed perfect. Solomon would be away for a few weeks, earning money, and he would return just as Anne came back and the summer season began. He discussed it with Anne. She was cautious by nature, and she asked the questions that any prudent person would ask. Did he know these men? Could he trust them? Did he have the offer in writing? Solomon admitted that he had only just met Brown and Hamilton, but they seemed legitimate. They had money, they were well-spoken, and they had provided references from other musicians who had worked with the circus. As for a written contract, such things were not always standard for short-term employment, especially in the entertainment business. Anne was not entirely convinced, but she also understood the practical realities of their situation. The money would be useful. Solomon was an experienced traveler. He had performed throughout the region, and he knew how to take care of himself. And he would have his free papers with him, documentation that proved his status as a free man. If there were any questions, any problems, he could produce the papers and resolve the situation. Solomon decided to accept the offer. He packed a small bag with clothes, his violin, and his free papers, a document that had been issued by the county clerk and bore official seals and signatures. The papers described him in detail: his age, his height, his complexion, his status as a free man born in New York. They were his insurance, his proof of identity, his protection. On March 20th, 1841, Solomon Northup left Saratoga Springs with Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. He kissed Anne goodbye, promised to write when he reached Washington, and set off on what he believed would be a brief, profitable journey. He had no reason to suspect that he would not see his family again for 12 years. He had no reason to believe that the two affable men traveling with him were anything other than what they claimed to be. And he had no way of knowing that his free papers, the documents he trusted to protect him, would be worthless the moment he crossed into Washington, D.C. The journey south was pleasant. They traveled by stagecoach and steamboat, stopping in Albany and then New York City. Brown and Hamilton were good company, and they paid Solomon promptly for his performances. In New York City, they stayed at a hotel near the docks, and Solomon played for small audiences in taverns and gathering halls. The circus performances were modest but well attended, and Solomon's violin playing was received with appreciation. From New York City, they traveled by steamboat down the coast and then up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C. The capital city in 1841 was a strange mix of grand ambitions and raw reality. The Capitol building and the White House stood as symbols of the young nation's aspirations, but much of the city was still undeveloped. Muddy streets, scattered buildings, and a transient population of politicians, lobbyists, and workers who came and went with the congressional sessions. Washington was also, paradoxically, one of the largest slave trading centers in the United States. Despite being the seat of the federal government, the city permitted slavery, and it hosted several slave pens where people were held before being sold and transported to plantations in the Deep South. The domestic slave trade was a massive industry in the 1840s, driven by the cotton boom in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. The demand for labor was so high that traders paid premium prices for slaves, and this created a lucrative market for kidnapping free black people in the North and selling them in the South. Solomon knew about the slave trade, but he believed his free papers would protect him. He had traveled before, and he had never had problems. Washington was the nation's capital after all. Surely the law would be respected there. Brown and Hamilton arranged lodging at a hotel near the capital. On their second evening in the city, March 24th, 1841, they invited Solomon to join them for dinner at a nearby tavern. It was a celebration, they said. The circus performances had gone well, and they wanted to mark the occasion. They ordered food and drinks, and the conversation was jovial. Solomon drank wine, something he did only occasionally, and he remembered feeling unusually warm, then dizzy. He excused himself, thinking he needed fresh air, but the dizziness intensified. He remembered stumbling, feeling hands supporting him, and then nothing. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Pain, darkness, the smell of damp stone, the sound of chains. Solomon tried to move and discovered that his wrists and ankles were shackled. His head throbbed with a pain so intense that thinking was difficult. He called out and his voice echoed in the darkness. Gradually, his eyes adjusted, and he could make out the shapes of stone walls, a heavy wooden door with a small barred window, and the forms of other people lying on the floor around him. He was in a slave pen, and according to the men who now controlled his fate, he had always been a slave. The slave pen was located on 7th Street in Washington, D.C., in less than a mile from the Capitol building. It was owned and operated by James Birch, a professional slave trader who had been in the business for years. The pen was one of several such facilities in the city, and it operated openly, with the full knowledge and tacit approval of local authorities. In 1841, slavery was legal in Washington, D.C., and the slave trade was a legitimate, if morally contested, business. The pen itself was a grim structure, a 2-story brick building with barred windows and heavy doors. The ground floor contained several large rooms, where enslaved people were held while awaiting sale or transport. The conditions were deliberately harsh: minimal food, no bedding, and constant surveillance. The purpose was not just containment, but demoralization, to break the spirit of anyone who might resist or claim they were free. Solomon's first clear memory after waking in the pen was of James Birch standing over him. Birch was a man in his 40s, well-dressed in the manner of a successful businessman, with cold eyes and a demeanor that suggested he had done this many times before. He asked Solomon his name. Solomon, still disoriented but beginning to understand the horror of his situation, told Birch the truth. His name was Solomon Northup. He was a free man from Saratoga Springs, New York. He had papers proving his freedom. There had been a mistake, a terrible mistake, and he needed to contact his family, his lawyer, anyone who could verify his identity. Birch's response was calm and methodical. He informed Solomon that his name was not Solomon Northup. His name was Platt. He was a runaway slave from Georgia, and he had been captured and returned to his rightful owner. Any claims to the contrary were lies, and lies would be punished. Solomon insisted. He described his home, his wife, his children. He named people in Saratoga Springs, judges, merchants, officials, who could vouch for him. He demanded to see his free papers, which he had carried with him from New York. Birch listened to all of this without expression. Then he left the room and returned with 2 other men and a wooden paddle. What followed was a beating so severe that Solomon lost consciousness. When he woke, he was alone in the cell, his back and legs covered in welts and cuts. He tried to move and discovered that even breathing was painful. Over the next few hours, as the pain subsided enough for him to think clearly, Solomon began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Brown and Hamilton had drugged him. The wine at dinner had been laced with something, probably laudanum or another opiate. While he was unconscious, they had taken his free papers and sold him to Birch. The papers were now destroyed or hidden, and without them, Solomon had no way to prove his identity. In the eyes of the law, he was now property. Birch had documentation, bills of sale, ownership papers that identified him as a slave named Platt. Solomon's word, the word of a black man claiming to be free, meant nothing against Birch's legal documents. Even if Solomon could somehow get a message to someone in New York, even if someone came looking for him, Birch's papers would be accepted as legitimate unless Solomon could produce his own documentation to counter them. And his documentation no longer existed. The other people in the pen told Solomon the truth he was beginning to realize. This happened all the time. Free black people were kidnapped in northern cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, drugged or beaten into submission and sold to traders like Birch. The traders had networks of accomplices who identified targets, lured them with job offers or other pretexts, and delivered them to the pens. Once in the pen, the victims' free papers were destroyed, and they were given new identities as slaves. Within days or weeks, they were sold and transported south, where they disappeared into the vast plantation system of the Deep South. The legal system offered no protection. In Washington, D.C., as in most of the country, the testimony of black people was not admissible in court against white people. Even if Solomon could somehow bring charges against Birch or Brown and Hamilton, he could not testify. And without testimony, there was no case. The system was designed to protect property rights, and in this system, Solomon was property. Solomon spent 2 weeks in Birch's pen. During that time, he was beaten twice more for insisting he was free. The beatings were not random acts of cruelty. They were calculated to break his will. Birch wanted slaves who were compliant, who had accepted their status, who would not cause trouble for the buyers. Resistance was punished swiftly and brutally. But the beatings also taught Solomon something crucial. He could not win by fighting. The system was too powerful, too entrenched. If he was going to survive, if he was ever going to escape, he would have to be smarter. He would have to play the role of the compliant slave while secretly maintaining his sense of self, his memory of who he was. He would have to wait for an opportunity, however unlikely, to prove his freedom. In early April, Solomon was transported from Washington to Richmond, Virginia, along with a group of about 40 other enslaved people. They were chained together in pairs and marched through the streets of Washington in broad daylight, past the Capitol building, past government offices, past citizens who watched with indifference or approval. The domestic slave trade was so normalized in Washington that such scenes were unremarkable. In Richmond, they were held in another slave pen for several days before being loaded onto a ship called the Orleans. The ship was bound for New Orleans, the largest slave market in the Deep South. The voyage took nearly 2 weeks, and the conditions were horrific. The enslaved people were kept below deck in a space so cramped that they could barely move. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of sweat and human waste. They were given minimal food and water, and several people became ill. 2 people died during the voyage, a young woman who had been sick when they boarded, and an older man who simply seemed to give up. Their bodies were brought up on deck and thrown overboard without ceremony, without prayer, without acknowledgement that they had been human beings with names and histories. Solomon watched this and understood that he was witnessing a system of dehumanization so complete, so thorough, that it could reduce people to cargo, to units of economic value, to things that could be discarded when they lost their utility. And he understood that if he was going to survive, he would have to resist this dehumanization in the only way available to him: by remembering. By holding on to his identity, his past, his sense of self, even if he could never speak it aloud. The Orleans arrived in New Orleans in late April 1841. The city was the commercial heart of the Deep South, a bustling port where cotton, sugar, and slaves were bought and sold in massive quantities. The slave market was located near the docks, a series of buildings and open yards where traders displayed their human merchandise to prospective buyers. Solomon and the others were taken to one of these markets, a facility owned by a trader named Theophilus Freeman. They were cleaned, given new clothes, and instructed on how to behave when buyers came to inspect them. Freeman was explicit. They were to look healthy, strong, and compliant. Any sign of illness, injury, or resistance would lower their value. Anyone who caused problems would be beaten. For several days, Solomon stood in Freeman's yard while buyers examined him. They inspected his teeth, his hands, his muscles. They asked him questions about his age, his health, his experience with farm work. Solomon answered carefully, saying as little as possible, trying to appear neither too intelligent nor too ignorant. Intelligence made buyers suspicious. Educated slaves were considered dangerous, but ignorance made them less valuable for certain types of work. Finally, in early May, Solomon was purchased by a man named William Ford. Ford was a Baptist preacher who owned a lumber mill and several thousand acres of pine forest in the Bayou Boeuf region of central Louisiana. He paid $1,000 for Solomon, a significant sum that reflected Solomon's apparent health and strength. Ford was, by the standards of the time and place, considered a relatively humane master. He did not use the whip excessively. He provided adequate food and shelter, and he allowed his slaves to attend religious services. But Ford was still a slaveholder, and his humanity existed entirely within the framework of a system that treated people as property. He owned Solomon, and that ownership was absolute. Solomon was transported to Ford's plantation, a journey of several days by boat and wagon through the swamps and forests of central Louisiana. The landscape was unlike anything he had seen in New York. Vast expanses of cypress swamps, dense pine forests, and an oppressive heat that made every movement exhausting. The plantation itself was isolated miles from the nearest town, accessible only by rough roads that turned to mud in the frequent rains. Ford put Solomon to work in the lumber operation, cutting and transporting pine logs. The work was hard, but Solomon was strong, and he quickly learned the rhythms of the job. Ford recognized Solomon's intelligence and began giving him more responsibility, supervising other workers, managing logistics, solving problems. For a few months, Solomon allowed himself to hope that Ford might be different, that he might listen if Solomon told him the truth about his past. But Solomon also observed Ford carefully, and what he saw was a man trapped in his own contradictions. Ford was genuinely religious, and he seemed to believe that slavery could be practiced in a Christian manner, that masters had a duty to treat their slaves with a degree of kindness and to provide for their spiritual welfare. But he never questioned the fundamental premise of slavery itself. He never considered that owning another human being might be incompatible with Christian teaching, and he never showed any sign that he would risk his own financial interests or social standing to help a slave claim freedom. Solomon decided to wait. He would watch for an opportunity, but he would not reveal his past to Ford. The risk was too great. If Ford didn't believe him, or if Ford reported him to the authorities, Solomon could be sold to a harsher master or even killed as a troublemaker. The opportunity never came. In late 1842, Ford fell into financial difficulties. He had borrowed money to expand his lumber operation, and he could not repay the debts. His creditors demanded payment, and Ford was forced to sell assets, including some of his slaves. Solomon was sold to a carpenter named John Tibeats to satisfy one of Ford's debts. The sale was a turning point. If Ford had represented the best that slavery could offer, a master who was not gratuitously cruel, who provided basic necessities, who acknowledged the humanity of his slaves even while denying their freedom, then Tibeats represented something far darker. Tibeats was a violent, unstable man who seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain. He beat his slaves for minor infractions, for perceived disrespect, for no reason at all. He was particularly hostile to Solomon, perhaps sensing that Solomon was more educated, more intelligent than the role he was playing. The conflict came to a head one day in the summer of 1843. Tibeats accused Solomon of doing work incorrectly, a trivial matter, a misunderstanding about how to construct a fence. But Tibeats used it as a pretext to beat Solomon with a whip. Solomon, pushed beyond endurance, fought back. He wrestled the whip away from Tibeats and struck him several times before other workers pulled them apart. It was an act of self-defense, but under Louisiana law, it was a capital crime. A slave who struck a white man could be executed, and the execution could be carried out by the master without trial. Tibeats, enraged and humiliated, left to get a rope, making it clear that he intended to hang Solomon. Solomon ran. He fled into the swamps that surrounded the plantation, wading through water that was waist-deep, hiding among the cypress trees and Spanish moss. He spent the night in the swamp, surrounded by snakes and alligators, listening to the sounds of men searching for him with dogs. He knew that if they caught him, he would be killed, but he also knew that he could not survive in the swamp indefinitely. He had no food, no shelter, and the swamp was full of dangers. At dawn, exhausted and desperate, Solomon made a decision that seemed insane, but was perhaps his only chance. He returned to Ford's plantation and begged for protection. Ford, who still technically owned a portion of Solomon's value as collateral for the debt Tibeats owed him, intervened. He negotiated with Tibeats, and eventually a solution was reached. Solomon would be sold again, this time to a planter named Edwin Epps. It was not freedom, it was not even safety, but it was survival. And for Solomon, survival was the only form of resistance available. Edwin Epps's plantation was located deep in the Bayou Boeuf region, a remote area of central Louisiana, characterized by swamps, forests, and scattered cotton plantations. The plantation itself was a world unto itself, isolated, self-contained, and governed by Epps's absolute authority. For Solomon, arriving at Epps' plantation in late 1843 marked the beginning of a new phase of his captivity, one that would last for nearly 10 years and test the limits of his endurance. Epps was a man in his early 40s, of medium height and wiry build, with a face that seemed perpetually set in an expression of suspicion and anger. He had been born poor, the son of a small farmer, and he had clawed his way to a position of relative prosperity through hard work, ruthless business practices, and an absolute belief in the racial hierarchy that justified slavery. He owned about 10 slaves when Solomon arrived, and he worked them with a brutality that was extreme even by the standards of the antebellum South. Epps's philosophy of slave management was simple and brutal. Slaves were property, no different from livestock, and they existed solely to generate profit. He measured their worth by the amount of cotton they could pick in a day, and he enforced his expectations with the whip. Every evening, the slaves were required to weigh their cotton. Those who had picked less than their assigned quota, typically 200 pounds for an adult, were whipped. The number of lashes corresponded to the number of pounds they were short. It was a nightly ritual, as predictable as sunset, and it created an atmosphere of constant fear. Solomon learned to pick cotton, though he was never as fast as those who had been doing it since childhood. Cotton picking was skilled labor, requiring speed, endurance, and technique. The bolls had to be plucked cleanly without including too much of the plant material, and the work had to be done quickly because the picking season was short. Only a few months between when the bolls ripened and when the weather turned. A skilled picker could harvest 300 pounds or more in a day. Solomon, despite his strength and intelligence, struggled to reach 200 pounds, especially in the early years. The whippings were not the only form of control. Epps also used psychological tactics to maintain dominance. He encouraged competition and distrust among the slaves, rewarding those who informed on others and punishing those who showed solidarity. He would sometimes force slaves to whip each other, making them complicit in the system of violence, and he used sexual violence as a tool of power, particularly against the women on the plantation. One of the enslaved women on Epps's plantation was named Patsy. She was in her early 20s when Solomon arrived, a woman of extraordinary beauty and even more extraordinary skill as a cotton picker. She could harvest 500 pounds in a day, far more than anyone else, and this made her valuable to Epps. But it also made her a target. Epps developed an obsession with Patsy, and he subjected her to repeated sexual assaults. His wife, Mary Epps, was aware of this and responded not by confronting her husband, but by directing her rage at Patsy, treating her with vicious cruelty and demanding that Epps punish her for imagined infractions. Solomon witnessed this and understood that he was living in a system where every human relationship was distorted by the fundamental violence of slavery. Epps's obsession with Patsy, Mary Epps's jealous rage, the forced complicity of the other slaves, all of it was a product of a system that treated people as property and gave masters absolute power over their lives. But Solomon also observed something else. The plantation was isolated, but it was not entirely cut off from the outside world. Occasionally, white men from outside the region would visit, traders, overseers, craftsmen hired to do specialized work. These men brought news, gossip, and sometimes different perspectives. And Solomon began to understand that if he was ever going to escape, it would not be by running through the swamps. It would be by finding someone from outside the system. Someone who might be willing to help him get a message to New York. The years passed slowly. Solomon worked in the fields, picked cotton, endured the whip, and played the role of the compliant slave. He never spoke of his past, never claimed to be free, never gave Epps any reason to suspect that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. But internally, he held on to his identity. He remembered his wife's face, his children's names, the streets of Saratoga Springs, the music he had played. He recited these memories to himself like prayers, using them to maintain his sense of self in a world designed to erase it. He also observed the legal and social structures that made escape nearly impossible. Louisiana law required all black people to carry passes signed by their masters if they traveled alone. Without a pass, anyone, any white person, could stop you, demand proof of your status, and return you to your owner for a reward. The roads were patrolled by men who made their living catching runaways, and the swamps that surrounded the plantation were vast and deadly. Men who ran into the swamps rarely came out alive, but the greatest barrier was not physical, it was legal. Solomon had no papers. He had no way to prove he had ever been free. Even if he could somehow reach New York, he would be traveling as a fugitive slave, subject to arrest under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required northern states to return escaped slaves to their owners. And Epps, like all slaveholders, had legal documentation proving his ownership. In any confrontation between Solomon's word and Epps's papers, the law would side with Epps. Solomon understood this with perfect clarity. He had watched other slaves try to escape and fail. He had seen men return to the plantation and beaten so severely they never recovered. He had seen women sold away from their children as punishment for attempting to run. He knew that escape, in the traditional sense, was impossible. So he began to consider a different kind of escape, one that didn't involve running at all. If he could not escape slavery, perhaps he could prove he had never legally been a slave in the first place. To do that, he would need to get a message to someone in New York who could verify his identity and bring legal proof of his freedom to Louisiana. But how? He couldn't write a letter himself. If Epps discovered he was literate, the consequences would be severe. Educated slaves were considered dangerous, and they were often sold further south or killed. He couldn't trust other slaves with the information. The risk of betrayal, whether intentional or under torture, was too high. He couldn't approach white people in the area. Most were connected to the plantation system and would report him immediately. He needed someone from outside Louisiana, someone who had no stake in the system, someone who might be willing to take an enormous risk for a stranger. And for years, no such person appeared. Then, in the summer of 1852, a white carpenter named Samuel Bass arrived at Epps's plantation to do construction work. Samuel Bass was a man in his late 40s, tall and lean, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors. He was originally from Canada, and he had spent much of his adult life traveling throughout the southern United States, working as a carpenter and builder. He was skilled at his trade, and he had a reputation for quality work, which meant he was in demand despite his tendency to speak his mind on subjects that most white Southerners considered settled. Bass was an abolitionist. He believed that slavery was morally wrong, economically inefficient, and incompatible with the principles of Christianity and democracy. These were dangerous opinions in Louisiana in 1852, where slavery was not just an economic system, but the foundation of social order. White Southerners who questioned slavery were viewed with suspicion and hostility, and those who actively opposed it could face violence, legal prosecution, or social ostracism. But Bass seemed unable or unwilling to keep his opinions to himself. He would argue with slaveholders, pointing out the contradictions in their justifications for slavery. He would cite the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, economic theory, anything he could use to make his case. Most slaveholders dismissed him as an eccentric, a harmless crank whose opinions were too absurd to take seriously. But some found him genuinely threatening, and Bass had been run out of more than one town for his views. Epps had hired Bass to build an addition to his house, a project that would take several weeks. Bass arrived in late July 1852 and set up a temporary workshop near the main house. He worked alone most of the time, but occasionally he would interact with the enslaved people on the plantation, asking them to help carry materials or hold boards while he worked. Solomon watched Bass carefully from the beginning. He observed how Bass spoke to the slaves, not with the casual contempt that most white men used, but with a basic courtesy that suggested he saw them as people rather than property. He listened when Bass got into arguments with Epps about slavery, debates that would take place in the evenings after work, often fueled by whiskey. In one such argument, which Solomon overheard while working near the house, Bass told Epps that slavery was a sin against God and man, that it degraded both the enslaved and the enslaver, and that it would eventually destroy the South. Epps responded with the standard defenses. Slavery was sanctioned by the Bible, black people were inferior and needed white guidance, the economy of the South depended on slave labor. Bass countered every point, his voice rising with passion, until Epps finally told him to shut up or leave. Bass didn't leave. He finished his whiskey, muttered something about Epps being a fool, and went back to his work the next morning as if nothing had happened. Solomon watched this exchange and began to consider a possibility that seemed both promising and terrifying. Bass might be willing to help him, but the risk was enormous. If Solomon revealed his past to Bass, and if Bass reported him to Epps, Solomon would be beaten, possibly killed. Even if Bass was genuinely opposed to slavery, that didn't mean he would risk his own safety for a slave he barely knew. And even if Bass agreed to help, there was no guarantee that any plan would succeed. Solomon spent weeks observing Bass, trying to assess his character, his reliability, his courage. He watched how Bass treated the other slaves, how he responded when Epps was cruel, how he conducted himself when he thought no one was watching. And gradually, Solomon came to believe that Bass was genuine, that his opposition to slavery was not just rhetoric but a deeply held conviction. But belief was not certainty, and Solomon knew he would only have one chance. If he approached Bass and Bass refused to help, or if Bass agreed but then betrayed him, Solomon's situation would become infinitely worse. He would be identified as a troublemaker, a slave who claimed to be free, and Epps would make sure he never had another opportunity to escape. In late August, Solomon made his decision. One evening when Bass was working alone in his workshop, Solomon approached him. His heart was pounding and his mouth was dry. He had rehearsed what he would say, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed inadequate. He began by asking Bass a question. "Master Bass, I want to ask you what part of the country you came from." Bass looked up from his work, surprised by the question. "I was born in Canada," he said. "Why do you ask?" Solomon hesitated, then took the plunge. "I have been here a long time. I have worked for Master Epps for many years, but I was not born a slave. I was born free in New York. I was kidnapped and brought here, and I have been trying to find a way to get word to my family." Bass stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, and Solomon felt a wave of terror. He had made a mistake. Bass was going to report him. Everything was about to fall apart. Then Bass spoke. "Tell me your story." Solomon told him everything. He described his life in Saratoga Springs, his work as a musician, his wife and children. He described the offer from Brown and Hamilton, the journey to Washington, the drugged wine, waking up in chains. He described the 12 years he had spent in Louisiana, the plantations, the masters, the brutality. He named names, dates, places. He spoke for nearly an hour, and Bass listened without interrupting. When Solomon finished, Bass asked questions. He wanted details, the names of people in Saratoga Springs who could verify Solomon's identity, the exact location of his home, the names of his wife and children. He asked about Solomon's free papers, and Solomon explained that they had been destroyed by the slave traders in Washington. Finally, Bass leaned back and let out a long breath. "If what you're telling me is true," he said, "then you've been the victim of one of the greatest crimes I've ever heard of, and if I can help you, I will." Solomon felt a surge of hope so intense it was almost painful, but he forced himself to stay calm. "How?" he asked. "How can you help me?" Bass thought for a moment. "I can write letters," he said. "I can write to people in New York, people you name, and tell them where you are and what's happened to you. If they can verify your story, if they can bring proof of your freedom, then maybe you can get out of here." "But it's dangerous," Solomon said. "If Master Epps finds out, I know the risk." Bass interrupted. "But I've been arguing against slavery for years, and I've never done anything about it except talk. Maybe it's time I did something real." Over the next few days, Bass and Solomon met several more times, always in secret, always when Epps was away or occupied. Bass wrote letters to people Solomon named, shopkeepers, lawyers, anyone who might remember him. He addressed the letters carefully, using his own name as the sender, and he explained the situation in detail. He described Solomon's appearance, his story, and his location. He asked the recipients to verify Solomon's identity and to contact the authorities in New York if they believed his story was true. Bass used his own money to pay for postage, and he mailed the letters from Marksville, the nearest town, during one of his trips to buy supplies. He told Solomon that it might take weeks or even months to get a response, if any response came at all. Letters could be lost. People might have moved or died, and even if someone received the letters and believed them, there was no guarantee they would be able to help. Solomon understood all of this, but for the first time in 12 years, he had hope. Someone knew his story. Someone was trying to help. And even if the letters failed, even if nothing came of it, he had taken action. He had refused to accept his enslavement passively. He had fought back in the only way available to him. Bass finished his work on Epps's house in early September and left the plantation. Solomon watched him go, wondering if he would ever see him again, wondering if the letters would reach anyone, wondering if this fragile thread of hope would hold or snap. And then he went back to the fields and waited. The weeks after Bass's departure were the longest of Solomon's life. Every day he woke before dawn, worked in the cotton fields until after dark, and endured the nightly ritual of weighing and whipping. But now, every day carried a new weight of anticipation and dread. Had the letters been delivered? Had anyone received them? Would anyone believe them? And if someone did believe them, would they be able to do anything about it? Solomon forced himself to maintain the same outward demeanor he had cultivated for years. The compliant, hard-working slave who caused no trouble and attracted no special attention. He could not afford to let Epps suspect that anything had changed. If Epps discovered that Solomon had contacted someone outside the plantation, if he learned that letters had been sent to New York, the consequences would be swift and brutal. But internally, Solomon was in turmoil. Hope and fear warred within him constantly. Hope that someone in Saratoga Springs had received Bass's letter and was taking action. Fear that the letters had been lost or ignored or dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Hope that his wife and children were still alive, still waiting for him. Fear that they had moved on, believing him dead, and that he would be forgotten. The cotton-picking season reached its peak in October and November. The weather was cooler, the bolls were ripe, and Epps drove his slaves harder than ever. Solomon picked cotton from dawn until well after dark, his hands bleeding from the sharp edges of the bolls, his back aching from the constant bending and reaching. At night, he would lie on the floor of the cabin he shared with the other slaves, too exhausted to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of New York, of freedom, of the impossible distance between where he was and where he wanted to be. In November, a white man came to the plantation asking for work. He was a drifter, a laborer looking for temporary employment, and Epps hired him to help with some repairs. The man stayed for a few days, and Solomon watched him carefully, wondering if he might be connected to Bass's letters. But the man showed no sign of recognizing Solomon or knowing anything about his situation, and eventually he left. December came, and with it, the end of the cotton season. The work shifted to other tasks, repairing fences, clearing land, preparing for the next planting. The pace was slightly less brutal, but the whippings continued for any perceived infractions. Epps was in a foul mood that winter, drinking heavily and taking out his frustrations on his slaves. Solomon began to lose hope. 3 months had passed since Bass had mailed the letters. If someone in New York had received them and believed them, surely they would have taken action by now. Surely someone would have come, or sent word, or done something. The silence was crushing. But Solomon didn't know what was happening hundreds of miles away in Saratoga Springs. He didn't know that one of Bass's letters had reached a shopkeeper named Cephas Parker, who remembered Solomon and believed the story. He didn't know that Parker had taken the letter to Henry Northup, a lawyer and the son of the man who had freed Solomon's father decades earlier. He didn't know that Henry Northup had read the letter with growing horror and had immediately begun taking action. Henry Northup was a man in his early 50s, a respected lawyer with connections to some of the most powerful people in New York State. He had known Solomon's father, and he had a personal sense of obligation to the Northup family. When he read Bass's letter, he believed it immediately. He knew Solomon, he knew the family, and he knew that Solomon had disappeared in 1841 under suspicious circumstances. The letter confirmed what Henry had long suspected. Solomon had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. But believing the story and rescuing Solomon were two very different things. Louisiana was a slave state, and it did not recognize the authority of New York officials. Solomon was legally the property of Edwin Epps, and Louisiana law protected that ownership absolutely. Henry Northup could not simply travel to Louisiana and demand Solomon's release. He would need legal authority, documentation, and a strategy for navigating Louisiana's legal system. Henry Northup began by petitioning the governor of New York, Washington Hunt. He presented Bass's letter, affidavits from people in Saratoga Springs who knew Solomon, and a detailed account of Solomon's disappearance in 1841. He argued that Solomon was a free citizen of New York who had been illegally kidnapped and enslaved, and that the state had a responsibility to protect its citizens. Governor Hunt was sympathetic, but he was also cautious. Intervening in the affairs of another state, especially on behalf of a black man claiming to be free, was politically sensitive. The relationship between northern and southern states was already tense in 1852, with debates over slavery threatening to tear the country apart. Hunt needed to be sure that the case was legitimate and that New York's intervention would be legally defensible. Henry Northup provided the evidence Hunt needed. He obtained a copy of Solomon's original free papers, which Anne Northup had kept safe for 12 years. He gathered affidavits from multiple people in Saratoga Springs who swore they knew Solomon as a free man. He documented Solomon's property ownership, his voting record, his reputation in the community, and he presented a legal argument based on New York state law, which authorized the governor to take action to protect free citizens who had been illegally enslaved. In late November 1852, Governor Hunt issued official documents authorizing Henry Northup to travel to Louisiana and retrieve Solomon. The documents included a formal request to Louisiana authorities to cooperate, though Hunt knew that Louisiana was under no legal obligation to do so. The success of the mission would depend on Henry Northup's ability to navigate Louisiana's legal system and find a judge willing to hear the case. Henry Northup left New York in early December, traveling by train and steamboat to New Orleans. He carried with him a leather satchel containing all the documentation he had gathered: Solomon's free papers, the affidavits, Governor Hunt's authorization, and Bass's letter. He also carried a significant amount of money, knowing that he might need to pay for legal fees, bribes, or other expenses. In New Orleans, Henry Northup consulted with a local lawyer who specialized in cases involving enslaved people claiming freedom. The lawyer was cautiously optimistic. Louisiana law did allow for such cases, though they were rare and difficult to win. The burden of proof was on the person claiming freedom, and the evidence had to be overwhelming. But if Henry Northup could locate Solomon, if he could bring him before a judge, and if he could present the documentation from New York, there was a chance, a small chance, that the case could succeed. The first challenge was finding Solomon. Bass's letter had mentioned Bayou Boeuf, but the area was vast, and plantations were scattered across miles of swampland. Henry Northup spent days traveling through the region, making inquiries, trying to find someone who knew of a slave named Solomon or Platt. Finally, in late December, he found a local resident who directed him to Edwin Epps's plantation. On January 1st, 1853, Henry Northup arrived at the plantation and asked to see Epps. Solomon was in the fields when word came that a white man was at the house asking about him. He felt a jolt of terror. Had Epps discovered the letters? Was he about to be punished? But then one of the other slaves told him that the man was asking for Solomon Northup, not Platt. Solomon's heart began to race. Someone had come. Someone from New York had actually come. He walked to the house, trying to keep his expression neutral, trying not to let hope overwhelm him. When he saw Henry Northup standing in the yard, talking to Epps, he almost didn't recognize him. It had been 12 years, and Henry had aged. But then Henry turned and looked at Solomon, and their eyes met, and Solomon knew that everything was about to change. The confrontation between Henry Northup and Edwin Epps was tense from the beginning. Epps was immediately suspicious and hostile. A northern lawyer arriving at his plantation and asking about one of his slaves was, in Epps's view, an outrageous intrusion. He demanded to know what business Henry Northup had with his property. Henry Northup remained calm and professional. He explained that he was acting on behalf of the state of New York and that he had reason to believe that the man Epps knew as Platt was actually Solomon Northup, a free citizen of New York who had been illegally kidnapped and enslaved. He presented Governor Hunt's authorization and requested that Solomon be released into his custody. Epps's response was immediate and unequivocal: no. He had purchased Solomon legally from another owner, and he had documentation proving his ownership. As far as Louisiana law was concerned, Solomon was his property, and no northern lawyer had any authority to take him. If Henry Northup wanted to pursue the matter, he could take it to court. But Epps was confident that no Louisiana judge would side with a black man claiming to be free over a white man with legal ownership papers. Henry Northup had anticipated this response. He had already contacted a local judge, a man named Robert Orton, and arranged for a hearing. Louisiana law did allow for cases where enslaved people claimed they had been illegally enslaved, though such cases were rare, and the burden of proof was enormous. Judge Orton had agreed to hear the case, and a hearing was scheduled for January 3rd, 1853, in the town of Marksville. Epps was furious, but he had no choice but to comply. He brought Solomon to Marksville on the appointed day, accompanied by his lawyer, a local attorney who specialized in defending property rights. The hearing took place in a small courtroom that was packed with spectators. Word had spread that a northern lawyer was trying to take a slave away from a local planter, and the white residents of Marksville were curious and hostile. They saw Henry Northup as an outsider, an abolitionist, a threat to their way of life. Solomon could feel their hostility as he stood in the courtroom. and he understood that the odds were stacked against him. Judge Orton was a man in his 60s, a Louisiana native who had spent his entire career upholding the laws of a slave state. He was not an abolitionist, and he had no particular sympathy for enslaved people claiming freedom. But he was also a man who took the law seriously, and he was willing to hear the evidence. Henry Northup presented his case methodically. He began by introducing Solomon's original free papers, which had been issued by the county clerk in New York and bore official seals and signatures. He explained that Solomon had been born free, the son of a freed slave, and that he had lived as a free man in Saratoga Springs for his entire life until his disappearance in 1841. He then presented affidavits from people in Saratoga Springs who swore they knew Solomon. There were statements from shopkeepers, neighbors, and local officials, all testifying that they recognized Solomon Northup as a free man, a musician, a property owner, and a respected member of the community. The affidavits included detailed descriptions of Solomon's appearance, his family, and his life in New York. Henry Northup also presented evidence of Solomon's disappearance. He had obtained records showing that Solomon had left Saratoga Springs in March 1841 and had never returned. He had statements from Ann Northup describing how her husband had gone to Washington, D.C. with two men who claimed to be circus promoters and had never come back. And he had Bass's letter, which described Solomon's location and his claim to have been kidnapped. Epps's lawyer countered with his own evidence. He presented bills of sale showing that Epps had purchased Solomon legally from another owner who had purchased him from William Ford, who had purchased him in New Orleans. He argued that these documents proved legal ownership and that Solomon's claims were lies, possibly coached by northern abolitionists trying to undermine the institution of slavery. He pointed out that Solomon had lived as a slave for 12 years without making any successful claim to freedom. If he was really a free man from New York, why hadn't he escaped? Why hadn't he contacted anyone? Why had he waited 12 years to make his claim? Henry Northup responded by explaining the barriers that had prevented Solomon from escaping or getting word to New York. He described the isolation of the plantations, the legal restrictions on black people's movement, the destruction of Solomon's free papers, and the fact that Solomon's testimony would not be admissible in a Louisiana court against white men. He argued that Solomon had been trapped in a system designed to make escape impossible, and that his survival for 12 years was itself a testament to his intelligence and determination. Then Henry Northup did something unexpected. He asked Solomon to play the violin. There was a moment of confusion in the courtroom. Epps's lawyer objected, arguing that this was irrelevant. But Judge Orton, intrigued, allowed it. A violin was brought into the courtroom. Someone had borrowed it from a local musician, and it was handed to Solomon. Solomon took the violin, and for a moment he simply held it, feeling the familiar weight, the smooth wood, the taut strings. It had been 12 years since he had played freely without fear, without the weight of slavery pressing down on him. And now, in this courtroom, with his freedom hanging in the balance, he was being asked to prove who he was through music. He began to play. He played a waltz that had been popular in Saratoga Springs in the 1830s, a piece he had performed at countless weddings and parties. He played with a skill and fluency that could not be faked, that spoke of years of training and practice. The music filled the courtroom, and for a few minutes, everyone was silent, listening. Then Solomon played another piece, and another. He played music that was known in New York but unfamiliar in Louisiana. He played with a style and technique that marked him as a trained musician, not someone who had learned to play by ear in the fields. When he finished, there was silence in the courtroom. Henry Northup spoke into that silence. "This man is not a field slave," he said. "He is a musician, a skilled violinist who performed for some of the most prominent families in New York. No one could play like that without years of training, and no slave trader would have invested in that kind of training for someone they intended to sell as a field hand." Judge Orton looked at Solomon for a long moment. Then he looked at the documents spread out on the table before him, the free papers, the affidavits, the bills of sale. He asked Solomon a series of questions. His full name, his wife's name, his children's names, the location of his home in Saratoga Springs, the names of people he had known there. Solomon answered every question with precision and detail. Finally, Judge Orton made his ruling. He stated that the evidence presented by Henry Northup was compelling and that Solomon's testimony was consistent and credible. He acknowledged that the bills of sale presented by Epps were legally valid documents, but he ruled that they were based on a fraudulent premise that Solomon had been a slave when he was sold in New Orleans. In fact, Solomon had been a free man who had been illegally kidnapped and enslaved. Judge Orton ruled that Solomon Northup was a free man, illegally enslaved, and must be released immediately. The courtroom erupted. Epps was furious, shouting that the ruling was an outrage, that Northern abolitionists were destroying the South, that no slave would be safe if judges started believing their lies. His lawyer argued that they would appeal, that they would take the case to a higher court. But Judge Orton's ruling was final. He ordered Epps to release Solomon into Henry Northup's custody immediately. Epps had no legal recourse. He could appeal, but the appeal would take months or years, and in the meantime Solomon was free. On January 4th, 1853, Solomon Northup walked out of the courthouse in Marksville as a free man. He had been enslaved for 12 years, 9 months, and 15 days. And now, suddenly, impossibly, he was free. The journey back to New York took nearly 2 weeks. Solomon and Henry Northup traveled by wagon to New Orleans, then by steamboat up the Mississippi River to Cairo, Illinois, and then by train through the northern states to Albany, and finally to Saratoga Springs. Every mile of the journey felt surreal to Solomon. He was traveling as a free man, not as property. He could speak freely, move freely, make decisions about his own life. And yet, he was also traveling through a country that was still deeply divided over slavery, where the Fugitive Slave Act meant that even free black people could be arrested and returned to the South on the flimsiest of pretexts. Henry Northup stayed with Solomon throughout the journey, partly to provide legal protection and partly because he wanted to ensure that Solomon made it home safely. They talked during the long hours of travel, and Solomon told Henry the full story of his 12 years in Louisiana, the plantations, the masters, the brutality, the small acts of resistance and survival. Henry took notes, recognizing that Solomon's testimony was historically important and needed to be preserved. They arrived in Saratoga Springs on a cold January afternoon. Solomon had sent a letter ahead from New York City, so Anne knew he was coming, but she had hardly dared to believe it was true. When Solomon walked through the door of their home, Anne collapsed into his arms, sobbing. She had waited for 12 years, never remarrying, never giving up hope, even when everyone told her he must be dead. The children were there too, though they were no longer children. Elizabeth was 24 years old, married with a child of her own. Margaret was 22, also married. Alonzo was 19, working as a laborer. They had grown up without their father, and they barely remembered him. But they welcomed him home, and slowly, over the days and weeks that followed, they began to rebuild their relationships. Solomon's return was news throughout the region. People came to the house to see him, to hear his story, to confirm that he was really alive. Some were genuinely happy for him. Others were curious, skeptical, or even hostile. There were people in Saratoga Springs who didn't believe his story, who thought he must have run away and was now making up excuses. But Solomon had documentation. He had Judge Orton's ruling. He had the affidavits from Louisiana. He had Henry Northup's testimony. And he had his own detailed, consistent account of what had happened to him. Within weeks of his return, Solomon was approached by David Wilson, a local lawyer and writer who had heard his story and recognized its importance. Wilson proposed that they collaborate on a book, a full account of Solomon's kidnapping, enslavement, and rescue. The book would serve multiple purposes. It would document Solomon's experience. It would provide evidence for potential legal action against his kidnappers, and it would contribute to the growing abolitionist movement by giving Northerners a detailed, first-hand account of slavery's brutality. Solomon agreed. Over the next few months, he and Wilson worked together, with Solomon dictating his story and Wilson writing it down, organizing it, and preparing it for publication. The result was 12 Years a Slave, published in the summer of 1853. The book was extraordinary in its detail and specificity. Solomon named names, the men who had kidnapped him, the traders who had sold him, the masters who had owned him. He described the economics of slavery, the legal mechanisms that sustained it, the daily violence and dehumanization. He wrote about the other enslaved people he had known, including Patsy, whose suffering had haunted him. And he wrote about the psychological toll of slavery, the constant effort required to maintain his sense of self in a system designed to erase it. 12 Years a Slave was published by Darby and Miller and sold for $1. It was an immediate success, selling over 30,000 copies in its first 3 years, an extraordinary number for the time. The book was reviewed in major newspapers, excerpted in abolitionist publications, and used as evidence in debates over slavery. It became one of the most important abolitionist documents of the 1850s, alongside Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Frederick Douglass's autobiographies. But Solomon wanted more than literary success. He wanted justice. He wanted the men who had kidnapped him to be held accountable. In 1854, Solomon traveled to Washington, D.C. to bring charges against James Birch, the slave trader who had held him in the slave pen. The case went to trial, and Solomon testified about what had happened to him. But the trial exposed the fundamental injustice of the legal system. Under Washington, D.C. law, Solomon's testimony was not admissible because he was black. The only testimony that could be used against Birch was from white witnesses, and there were none. Birch was acquitted. Solomon also tried to bring charges against Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, the men who had lured him to Washington and drugged him. But they had disappeared. No one knew their real names or where they had gone. They were likely using different identities, continuing to kidnap free black people and sell them into slavery. The failure to achieve legal justice was devastating for Solomon. He had survived 12 years of slavery. He had escaped. He had told his story. And the men who had destroyed his life faced no consequences. But his story had an impact that went beyond individual justice. 12 Years a Slave was read by thousands of people, and it changed minds. It provided concrete, detailed evidence of how the domestic slave trade operated, how free black people were kidnapped and enslaved, and how the legal system protected slaveholders while offering no protection to the enslaved. It was used by abolitionists in their campaigns, cited in speeches and articles, and contributed to the growing Northern opposition to slavery. Solomon spent the rest of his life in upstate New York. He gave lectures about his experiences, speaking at abolitionist meetings and churches. He worked various jobs, farming, carpentry, music, trying to rebuild the life that had been stolen from him. But the 12 years in Louisiana had taken a toll. He was in his mid-40s when he returned, and the physical and psychological damage from slavery was permanent. The details of Solomon's later years are frustratingly sparse. There are records of him giving lectures in the mid-1850s, and there are a few letters and documents that mention him. But after about 1857, he disappears from the historical record. There is no record of his death, no grave that has been definitively identified as his. He simply vanishes, much as he had vanished in 1841. Historians have speculated about what happened to him. Some believe he may have died in the late 1850s or early 1860s, possibly from illness or injury related to his years in slavery. Others suggest he may have moved to Canada, where many free black people relocated in the years before the Civil War to escape the threat of kidnapping and re-enslavement. Still others believe he may have been kidnapped again, that the men who had taken him in 1841, or others like them, may have targeted him a second time. The mystery of Solomon's final years is frustrating, but it is also, in a way, fitting. His story is about the fragility of freedom, the ease with which a person can be erased, and the extraordinary effort required to resist that erasure. The fact that we don't know how his story ends is a reminder that for every Solomon Northup who escaped and told his story, there were thousands of others who disappeared and were never heard from again. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, Solomon's story reminds us that history is full of mysteries that challenge our understanding. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.